Welcome to our live stream tonight. It's my pleasure to bring Anat Shenker-Osorio to the show tonight to help progressive healthcare activists with our messaging. She is a messaging guru, the principal of ASO Communications and host of the Words to Win By podcast. And her specialty is how certain messages falter where others deliver. So here, without further ado, is Anat.
Thank you so much, Laura. What an honor to be with you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this Monday evening. I'm going to get us cooking. I'm assuming that somebody on Laura's end will tell me if there's anything going on technically, but otherwise I will just get us started because I'm going to take us on a whirlwind tour of what we are calling how to make believe, otherwise known as principles of persuasion and mobilization. So oftentimes when we get into a conversation about messaging, we get handed this bit of wisdom: meet people where they are. And if we could be physically together, I would ask you how many of you have been handed this bit of wisdom, and I'm going to hazard the guess that most of you have. And so what I would say to you is that, yeah, there's incredible importance to understanding where people are and what's resonating and what's making sense to them, but that as a messaging approach is at best inadequate. Cannot meet people where they are because where they are on too many of our issues sucks. And in fact, we are not here to be a thermometer. We are not here to take the temperature. We are here to change the temperature. In essence, to bring people from that place they are to an understanding of where they are capable of going and how it is aided by our words and our images. And of course, our stories and our conviction, we can bring them from that often unhelpful place to where we need them to be. Because here is what we know about human cognition. There is no place that people are. Much like you are seeing, hopefully, on my screen, you see an image that is toggling between a profile and a frontal view and a profile and a frontal view, and it's going back and forth before your eyes. And so this is a visual metaphor to represent what I cannot do through the magic of live stream, which is cut open your brain, probably for the best, and show you that our brains toggle between competing views of, quote unquote, the way the world works. And what we find is that for most people, people who are not hard partisans, very, very solidly ideologically left or ideologically right, never going to be persuaded, not going to be moved, the vast bulk of people ideologically toggle between these competing views. And so they can believe, for instance, that paying people a minimum of $15 an hour is absolutely necessary to make ends meet, and that doing so will send goods disastrously out of reach. And they kind of switch hit between these points of view. And what we find through research is that ideologically persuadable people, they are especially prone to what we call anchoring effects. That is, changing their mind based on information and especially repetition, what gives them what we call cognitive ease, what feels familiar to them. And so the name of the game is really to understand how to toggle people into the most progressive view they can have of our issue and to hold them there. And the way that we do that is through context, which I'll explain in a minute. The way that we reference context in linguistics is through the much abused and overused word frame. This is not a scary word. It just means that if I say something as simple as I went to a restaurant last night, you instantly think of food. You think of utensils, dishes, serving staff, but you don't think of a hula hoop or a circus clown because presumably, unless you've forgotten in this pandemic, which is forgivable, you know what a restaurant is. So what frames allow us to do is to communicate efficiently, to not have to explain every facet of every word. Or, as I jokingly like to tell my clients sometimes, you pay me to tell you that words mean things. So here is a simple example from a study we did a number of years ago now for Open Society Foundations. What you're seeing here is a split sample where people on the left are asked how favorably or unfavorably they feel toward prescription drug companies, and people on the right are asked that about drug corporations. And what you can see is that for the bulk of our sample, around 60% of people who are persuadable on this topic, they flip from being net positive in blue and dark blue to being net negative in yellow and orange. I think that we can agree that a drug company and a drug corporation is really synonymous. It's the same thing, but people reason remarkably differently about these two entities. And so something as simple as a single word can alter people's perception. So let's take what is arguably one of the most famous examples in framing. This will probably be familiar to many of you. If I were to tell you I need relief from something and it's a really big burden and I need a break from it, you would probably think of something negative, a duty or a disease or a pain. People, if they're being honest, will often tell me when I ask for what could go into this category, they will say my job or my kids, or of course, taxes. We need tax relief for Americans who are struggling to make ends meet. The tax burden on low-income families is simply too great. We need a tax break for the middle class in America. So what we're doing when we use language like this is that we are unwittingly impugning taxes. We are sending the message with our language that taxes are an affliction from which we need some sort of alleviation or, of course, relief. And it's actually even worse than that. When we are in a taxes frame, the things that we are bringing top of mind is the stuff in that smaller circle: H&R Block, deductions, payroll, April 15th, or what used to be April 15th, date has changed, as you know, because of the pandemic. What we are eclipsing from view is the stuff that taxes pay for. Basically, we on the left are the only people who attempt to sell a product by saying, look at the price. Did I mention the price? Also, let's talk about the price. What we need to do is get people excited about what the taxes pay for, and then if push comes to shove, we can talk about price tags, but what we need to be doing is selling the product. The same goes for when we are in a worker frame, when we are referencing people as workers. When we are in a worker frame, what we are bringing top of mind is the stuff in that smaller circle: tasks, paychecks, coworkers, etc. But what we are eclipsing from view is the rest of life, which is arguably a larger category into which work should fit, not be the all-consuming whole of it. So what would it mean to toggle from a work frame into a life frame? I want to show you an example from an ad from Australia. I used to do a considerable amount of work in Australia. I say used to because since the pandemic, obviously, they have been in incredibly strict lockdown, but involved in ongoing work there, both around people seeking asylum and around the union movement and some support to the Labour Party. So here is a union ad.
Where's your mum, sweetheart?
Her boss made her work today.
Don't you think it's time? Yeah, but the bank won't give us the loan, Dad. It's Tony's job. Yeah, but they've still got him on a short-term contract. More and more, the demands of business are eating away. The basic rights unions have won for all of us.
Geez, you must be raking it in with all these extra hours you're doing. I hope they're paying you. Listen, why don't you say something?
Have you met my boss?
That's why unions are standing up for a better life for all workers and their families.
So other than them sneaking in that word worker at the end and the unbearable whiteness of Australia, hopefully what you notice about that ad is that it takes place in exactly 0 workplaces. There isn't a single workplace depicted. There is home, there is after-school activities, because what we find is that people reason about work through the lens of home. What people tell us in research is, I work for my family. The reason I go to work is for my family. And so when we attempt to entertain an argument, to push an argument about, say, wages and working conditions through the lens of wages and working conditions, things will be better on the shop floor, you'll have better conditions, you'll be paid more. People are into that. But when instead we say you'll be paid enough to put food on the table and be home in time to eat it, people are much more excited about that. Consider, for example, paid leave. Just that phrase, the notion that you're being paid to leave, it's really kind of gross. You're not being paid to leave, right? That assumes that the human's default setting is at the work site, and now they're doing this aberration. They are leaving to go care for an elderly parent, or to help a partner who is injured, or to care for a new baby. In fact, you're being paid to care, right? So in Australia, we flipped this around again and we called it paid time to care. So that's just some opening remarks around framing. Now let's get into the meat of this, of how to make believe. So the first thing I want to cover is to say what you're for. Basically, if you forget everything else that happens today, nothing else gets through. Say what you're for, say what you're for, say what you're for. I often like to joke that if the left had written the story of David, it would be a biography of Goliath, because we like to talk about our opposition all of the time. And it is true that our opposition is big and nefarious and terrible, and there seems to be no bottom. Every day I am astounded at the bottomlessness of their depravity. And so I completely understand, believe me, the impulse and the instinct to talk about them all the time. But what we find is that when we talk about our opposition all of the time, what we are doing is, first of all, we are repeating what they say, because it is very, very difficult. It can be done, and I will show you how, to call out the opposition, which we do need to do, but not actually repeat their lies. And second of all, if we are only focused on the opposition and we are not focused on what we are for, what we want, what we can deliver, and on giving agency to our audiences, which is incredibly important, then that breeds cynicism. And what we see over and over again is that our opposition is not the opposition, it's cynicism. It's not that people don't think our ideas are right, it's that they don't think our ideas are possible. And so why bother even trying? The first way in which we often unwittingly repeat our opposition is through simple negation, right? Immigrants are not terrorists. These laws will not make us any safer. Seeking asylum is not a threat to our security. This will not cost us jobs. Such and such a policy is not going to grow the deficit. This healthcare spending bill will not result in lower quality of care. Anytime you are taking what they say and attempting to engage with it by sticking a simple knot in it, what we find is that people recall the assertion, but they don't recall whether it was true or false. The same goes for myth busting. The only myth worth busting is that that works. That is just basically free advertising to your opposition. So an example of an evolution from negation to affirmative messaging: 2013, here was Australia on the topic of seeking asylum. Classic negation. It's not illegal. Learn the facts and show your support today. Because, of course, the reason why the government of Australia was shunting people to offshore prisons, because they didn't know the facts. That was sarcasm. That is not true. To 2015, right before we did the research, the only developed country in the world that locks up children seeking asylum. So this kind of what I call harms and horrors messaging, this is an attempt to garner sympathy. This is an attempt to make people feel, quote unquote, to feel sorry for, quote unquote, those people. And those people in this case might be kids seeking asylum. It could be people experiencing homelessness. It could be people who are needing long-term medical care. It could be people who are struggling with addiction to opioids. But anytime we are relying upon a sympathy message, a message that in essence is feel sorry for those people, we are engaged in otherizing. Because if we are asking people to feel sorry for those people, that is by definition not us. To where the advocacy community pivoted in 2016 after the research, I want to be a human rights lawyer. There are people on this planet you can help by doing simple things. And here we see Amir, notice not a child, a unmarried man, who is in fact at the time of this photo detained, but doesn't appear to be. I'm happy to say he no longer is, because the human rights sector, and here Get Up, which is the Australian equivalent of Move On, it's an online organization and platform, was able to win 4 sequential campaigns, including the one you see depicted, bring them here. You want to talk about an audacious demand, an affirmative demand, not end this, not stop that, not don't do this, but bring them here. I know that it can feel often like there is no affirmative demand to make because we are subjected constantly to harms and horrors. I feel it. But I would urge you to recognize that there always is. So here is an example.
You are my sunshine, my only sunshine.
Me alegras así.
You never know, dear, how much I love you.
Nunca quitas mi cielo de mí.
The other night, dear, as I lay sleeping,
I dreamt I held you in my arms. Despertarme no te tenía. Escondí mi cabeza y lloré.
please don't take my sunshine away.
Tested it many times. We can create a fair immigration process compared to end this, abolish that, stop this, always does better. And it has the added benefit of actually being an affirmative demand. It's not just through simple negation that we are falling into the trap of reinforcing our opposition story. We almost always have negative demands, and this is really detrimental to us because it is a missed opportunity for us to paint a picture of what I like to call the beautiful tomorrow that people will hunger for and want to get on board. Because remember, we don't just need people to believe what we're saying, we need them to act on our behalf. And so we really need to be attendant to that cynicism issue. Again, it can feel like, how could there possibly be an affirmative thing to say? And again, I would urge you to recognize that there always is. This was one of the ads that we tested and utilized in the cycle, and in terms of altering people's perceptions of last summer's protests to defend Black lives, it was one of the most effective. So first and foremost, we want to say what we're for. We also want to remember the rule that people do things. Unfortunately, right now, the norm in a lot of progressive advocacy is to write sentences with what we call technically inagentive constructions. These are constructions in which it is not clear who actually wrought these harms, right? So this sounds like children of color experience the least qualified teachers, homes were lost, the racial wealth gap is growing, people's health is declining, claims are denied, such and such group are disproportionately impacted, disparities begin to emerge. In all of these sentences and the bazillions of others that we could add to them, what we see is that it is not clear the origin story of the problem that we are confronting. I would posit to you, as a person who routinely loses her keys, her cell phone, her wallet, that I have never managed to misplace my house. I just never have. You have to try really hard to misplace a house, and I would argue you probably can't. Unless we establish at the outset that a problem is person-made, that Jamie Dimon, in essence, took your house, it becomes cognitively inconsistent to believe that it could be person fixed. And so we want our sentences to obey the people do things rule. What we find over and over again is that when we do not make the cause of a problem clear, when we do not make it obvious that it was somebody's choice, we land ourselves in a heap of trouble. Here is an example. So this is a posting around the stark racial disparities in COVID vaccinations. This was from a while ago. And you can see, what is this doing? This is saying Group A is different to Group B. Group A has lower vaccination rates than Group B, in this case, Black Americans and white Americans. And the first comment, true to form, and I know never read the comments, is someone saying it could be because they aren't going to get the vaccine. We shouldn't jump to conclusions without investigation. What we find over and over again is that when we simply present a problem and we do not provide the origin story, people fill that in for themselves. Because again, words, sentences, ideas, Facebook posts occur in context. And so whatever is default top of mind for people is what they are going to use to fill in the rest of the story. And frequently they will be A, inaccurate, and B, incredibly unhelpful. Number 3, we want to sell the brownie and not the recipe. So this comes by way of a friend upholsterer, Dave Metz, at a firm called FM3 that is based here in California, where I'm based. When you walk through the grocery aisle and you see this box, again, if we were together, I would actually ask you this question. Say to you, what do you see a picture of on this box? And presumably you would tell me, I see a picture of a brownie and not. And then I would say to you, and then when you open this box, is there a brownie inside of this box? And you would sadly declare that there is no brownie in this box. I'm guessing I'm not bursting anybody's bubble. You all knew this. There is powder, right? There is powder in this box. And on the back, there is a recipe, a set of steps that you need to follow to turn said powder into said brownie. We need to stop selling the recipe and start selling the brownie. When you look at what you are saying to people, you want to consider, am I selling the policy, which we do not need to be taking out in public, or am I selling the outcome? When we ask people, do you think we should increase the minimum wage? The majority of Americans are with us. When we say, do you think everyone should be paid enough to care for their families? Way more people say yes. When we say, should we have federal paid family leave? People say yes. When we say, should everyone be there the first time your newborn smiles? More people say yes. We want to sell the outcome of the policy. So rather than saying, for example, universal single-payer healthcare, we want to say things like, you can go and see the doctor you need and not worry about the bill that comes home to you later. You want to sell the feeling that people will have once the policy is implemented. Order matters. We find that the exact same message tested with the sentences shifted around tests differently. And the order that works is values, villain, vision. So it is not that we don't name our problems. We do. It's just that we don't have as our opening salvo, boy, have I got a problem for you. It turns out most people got 99 problems and they don't want ours. So what we need to do is stick that problem, stick that villain, stick that origin story and cause in between the desirable things that we believe and that we are going to make happen. So here is a simple example from an ad. So that is not that different than the, I don't know how many hundreds, thousands of ads that happened around the pandemic. But the essential alteration is that rather than begin with a rightful and strident critique of everything the previous administration was doing that was an utter and complete failure, it begins with everyday Americans who are doing the right thing, who are delivering meals, who are delivering masks, who are standing with and for each other, coming together, speaking out, caring. And what we find is that unless we present that first step, it's not that people don't believe the second one, it's that it unleashes again that unrelenting cynicism, which is completely understandable. How could people not feel that? And remember that our job is to enlarge this choir. Our job is to move beyond the already activated. People who are already activists, likely those listening right now, are like, what are you talking about, Anat? I'm totally motivated by horrible things. Boy, have I got a problem for you is my love language. Yes, I do understand that. But we activists are an aberration. When we look at what works on the unactivated base, meaning folks who are ideologically aligned with us, they agree with our policy solutions, but they are not doing much. Maybe they're voting and not even that. What we find is that fear-based messaging, it evokes not a fight response out of them, but a freeze response. And so we need to be attendant to the fact that our messaging needs to land in order to activate, not with the already active. That is what the mobilization message needs to do. And so we first open with a shared value that is a concept and an ideal that we want to live up to, that's broadly shared across different kinds of people and groups in our society. We then name the villain second. We call out who created the problem and how it violates that shared value. In this, the villain is both doing their terrible, horrible things to the particular harmed group, and they are violating that shared value. It's a double whammy. That then creates cognitive dissonance. Oh, we have this thing that we want. We have this way of living that we desire. And now we have this villain that's getting in the way of that. We resolve that cognitive dissonance with the closing idea, the vision, which is that shared future that we can achieve with whatever policy solution we are pushing, with whatever call to action we are promoting. We also need to remember that politics isn't solitaire. Unfortunately for us, people don't just hear from us. If they did, our lives would be so much easier. We probably wouldn't be on this live stream at this hour. We'd be doing something else. But they hear constantly from the other side, as all of you know all too well. And so we need to recognize not just how our messages land in some sort of magical vacuum, but how they act as a rebuttal to what the other side is saying. This is where the work of a particular form of communication known as the race-class narrative comes in really prominently. This is work that I was incredibly proud to be part of with a prominent racial justice scholar, UC Berkeley, California law professor Ian Haney-Lopez, literally wrote the book Dog Whistle Politics and more recently Merged Left. Heather McGee, who at the time was the president of Demos when we first did this work in 2017, folks at SCIU, Faith in Minnesota, incredible pollsters that we have been at this since 2017, then retested it in 2020 and continue to keep iterating, testing it, and implementing it. So the essential idea, the sort of core insight that Ian brought to this, that formed the backbone of the beginning of this research, is that what we are facing, the right-wing narrative that we have confronted arguably since our founding, and certainly to an amped-up degree since Nixon's quote-unquote Southern strategy, is the use of racial fears. And those fears can be existential. They're not coming in the right way. They don't believe in our way of life. Inner city crime, right? Things we're hearing right now about critical race theory, things that we are hearing right now about crime supposedly spiking. Those fears can be economic. The magical immigrant who is both taking your job and not working, who is abusing emergency room services, who is, taking from our incredibly generous, more sarcasm for you, welfare system. And while the effect of those fears is to create enmity against Black people, brown people, other people of color, its core purpose, it's important to understand, especially if we are advocating for universal programs like healthcare, is to create a disgust of and a distrust of government itself. It is to undermine the idea that we can have broad-based prosperity. We can have universal single payer. We can have universal paid time to care. We can have a robust social safety net. We can have free, excellent, equitable K-12 and higher ed. And the reason that we can't have, in essence, nice things, we can't have an us, is because there's a them. There's a them that just refuses to work. There's a them that's just abusing services and is just lazy. There's a them that just doesn't teach their children the right thing. And because we're meant to understand there's a them, we're supposed to view government as a bad thing that takes from quote unquote hardworking people who are coded as white and hands it to profligate people who are coded as Black and brown. That breeds economic resentment, and the cycle goes on and on. I'm sure many of you are acutely aware of the fact that if there were a way to exclude all people from a healthcare system, then we would already have a functional universal single payer thing if we could simply render it exclusive. And so unless we confront this right-wing narrative, there's no such thing as race neutral. The left's choice to remain silent about race does not end the race conversation. It just means that all that voters hear is the unrepentant dog whistling of the right. Where this has left the left for a very long time is in this tired conversation where one group of people tells us the left lost its way because we need to talk about bread and butter issues, wages, working conditions, costs of college, healthcare. And if we would just do that and not attend to these other concerns, then we would be in good shape. And then we have the core of a progressive base reminding us that that base is largely people of color. And if we're not attending to issues of racial justice, then we have a mobilization problem, which we know we have in this country in terms of turning people out consistently. And then we have people who tell us to do both, right? And where that has left us is in what I have come to call the dependent clause message. It sounds like this. It's getting harder and harder to make ends meet, comma, and that affects African Americans in particular. Or healthcare is increasingly expensive, comma, and that affects Latinos in this specific way. It's where we name an economic issue, we remember we were supposed to talk about race, and so we stick it over here. The issue with that dependent clause approach is that for too many people of color in our sample, it sounds like an afterthought because it is an afterthought. For too many white people in our audiences, it sounds like a non sequitur. You were just talking about how expensive this is. Now you're talking about this group. What? And thirdly, as I raised earlier, when we name a disparity, when we simply say group A is different than group B, people fill in the reason for themselves. And the answer that they fill in is wrong. And it is rooted in the exact same sexism, racism, patriarchy, heterosexism, etc., that we already know we sort of all swim around in. And so the narrative that we have come to is a narrative that makes inseparable and intertwined these notions of race and class. It doesn't render them a both and, it renders them a together. And it follows, probably not shocking to you, a particular order. Again, it opens with a shared value that names race and class explicitly. It then names the problem second, not first. And it names that problem as either deliberate division by the opposition or racial scapegoating. And it conveys how that division or scapegoating is a weapon that hurts us economically. And so it is both a harm to the affected community and it is a means by which they harm all of us by getting us to look the other way or point our finger in the wrong direction. It then emphasizes unity and collective action to solve that problem. And presumably it has a call to action. So it connects the act that we want people to take, whatever that is, based on what we're trying to get done, to the desired outcome. So what that sounds like in an ad is this.
We want our communities to be healthy and vibrant. And so we march together
to demand justice.
While a handful of politicians try to make us fear each other, we're onto them. And we count on us. And so we turn up.
And we turn out as voters.
To make this a place where liberty and justice are for all.
For all.
For all.
Para todos.
Vote.
There's a lot, so I'm going to show you one more example. This is one of the originals that we did this on. This was from 2018 in Minnesota. See if for yourself you can pick out the opening, cross-racial solidarity, shared value. If you can pick out the deliberate division, how the opposition is called out. Notice we don't repeat what they say. We call out what they say and we ascribe motivation. And then the closing call for cross-racial solidarity with the call to action.
In Minnesota, we know long winters. And we know how to dig our neighbors out of the snow. Because whether it's our first Minnesota winter or our 50th, we've all been there. So when certain politicians want to divide us and make us afraid, we know that means they've got nothing else to offer. We're onto them. There are lots of ways to be Minnesotan, and all of them are greater than fear. In Minnesota, we're better off together. Vote greater than fear between now and November 6th.
Greater than fear was our campaign branding across a whole range of organizations. Happy to answer questions about that. And then finally, the last principle in how to make believe, to both persuade and mobilize, is that if your words don't spread, they don't work. So this story comes by way of my incredible friend, political strategist, Erica Payne. Miracle Whip, Kraft Foods, spends 95 cents of every one of its advertising dollars on the people that it calls its super heavy users. These are people who always buy Miracle Whip, only buy Miracle Whip, can be relied upon to purchase Miracle Whip in perpetuity. I would ask, why would you spend 95 cents of your dollar on the people that you already have? Of course, you can't answer me. But the answer is that they are, in marketing parlance, your brand advocates. They are the people who will, forgive the pun, spread the gospel of Miracle Whip and will take a recipe that the person in charge of super heavy user accounts will send to them. They will make a chocolate cake with Miracle Whip, serve it at the family reunion. This is pre-COVID. And people will eat that cake and say, wow, this is moist and delicious. What's in it? And the person says, Miracle Whip. Huh. I'm disgusted, but I'm also strangely intrigued. Because of course, if Kraft Foods says to you, make this cake, and you are not a Miracle Whip brand advocate, you are not intrigued. But if you have already got that cake in your mouth and you have enjoyed it, suddenly here you are entertaining that possibility. Because what Madison Avenue and the right wing understands is that a message is like a baton that has to be passed from person to person to person. And if it gets dropped anywhere along the way, it is by definition not persuasive. And so this perennial conversation that we have around election time, are we doing turnout? Are we doing persuasion? Are we doing turnout? Are we doing persuasion? Turnout is persuasion. If you cannot get people to hear your message, it cannot persuade them. And so first and foremost, we need to understand how to activate our choir, how to get that choir to sing from the same songbook in order to be making a joyful noise. I'm sure many of you have heard the chiding, oh, you're just preaching to the choir. Well, I would posit to you that the choir is where the trouble starts. And if we can't get them to sing in harmony, then we cannot break a signal through the noise. What we see over and over again is that repetition is its own form of persuasion. When people feel a message to be familiar, they rate it to be more credible and they like it better, just simply because they have heard it before. And so it's incredibly important that we get folks, especially people who are not already activists, to be singing from the same songbook. We also, of course, have to persuade people. And what we find about this ideological middle, as I said earlier, is that they are most prone to this toggling. I call them the good point people. They're like this, good point, but also good point, but yeah, good point. What they hear repeated most often becomes quote unquote common sense in the way the world works. And so if they hear lies repeated, like a universal healthcare program is somehow going to be bad and evil and slow, and it's going to be rationing, and you're going to be making terrible choices about grandma, then that seeps in and they believe that. But if they hear repeated over and over again that a universal program is how we get and stay well, it's how we care for ourselves and each other, then that seeps in and that becomes the dominant idea for them. And then, of course, there are some people we have to recognize who cannot, shall not, will never agree with us. That is our opposition. The opposition is not all of the people in one party. The opposition are the people who are ideologically against our values, against our beliefs, against our policy solutions. They should not like what we are saying. If your opposition likes what you're saying, what are you saying? You are either not advancing a political argument because you're just saying something blandly inoffensive like puppies are cute, which is totally a fine thing to say. It's just that puppies don't really need PR. Doesn't really help advance our argument. Or you are inadvertently reinforcing messages that actually activate your opposition. Let me give you an example. When we find that when we talk about how Medicare for all is cheaper, Medicare for all is a cheaper option. Don't need to tell anybody listening. You already know that. I know that too. What that actually does is it reinforces the notion that the way to make public policy decisions is around the price tag, that the number one thing that we should actually be looking at and concerned about is how much does it cost, as opposed to we can make sure we can get and stay well. And not that it's cheaper in the aggregate, but that it will be cheaper for you as an individual, not to the whole system. Because what we find is that when we say this is going to be cheaper, this is going to save government money, this will reduce the deficit, those arguments, in an attempt to sound reasonable, they actually freak out the middle. Because what it activates in the middle is the fear of the rationing, that the healthcare will not be as good. And so instead, what we want to say is, no matter what we look like or where we come from, when someone we love is ill or injured, our priority becomes getting them well without fearing we'll go bankrupt to do it. But today, here's the second sentence, the problem, a handful of healthcare corporations or CEOs or big pharma or whomever your villain is, depending on what you're trying to get done, are putting our life and health up for sale to mint a profit, hoping to turn us against each other so we'll look the other way while they put healthcare out of our reach. By joining together and demanding healthcare for every single one of us, Black or white, native or newcomer, north and south, big city or small town, we can make this a place where our families can get and stay well. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we can have convo.
Thank you so much for all the wisdom you've dropped on us. And my first question is, you've laid out these ideas and principles with examples from ads, but most of us are storytellers. We use our own first-person stories to make our points and push for our advocacy. How does what you've laid out apply to the kind of messaging we do? Telling our own personal stories at a press conference or event, or writing an op-ed to share?
Yeah, great question. And first, I just want to thank you all for all of the work that you do. I think it's so important and incredible, and I'm just really grateful. Grateful to Laura, and I'm grateful to all of you who literally give of yourselves, right, in the form of story. So what I would say to that is that the principles are the principles. And so it is totally understandable why, when you have an incredibly affecting personal story, like I know you do, Laura, for example, that you would want to lead in with actually what differentiates you from me. The fact that you have, as such a young person, faced and cancer. I'm guessing that's not news, right? You've shared that story. I'm not outing you. I wouldn't want to out you. I don't think I am. That what you want to begin with the personal story is that same sense of connection. And so I'm going to make something up. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but let's pretend it's me. So I'm not putting words in your mouth. You say, I'm Anat, and I'm not going to pick me because I don't want to pick a quirky thing about me. I'm going to pick a random person. I'm going to pick Jose. I'm going to make him up. Jose is a baseball nut. You name a game, you name a stat, he's got it memorized and he can tell you all about it. Jose never missed a game. He never missed a broadcast. He knew blah, 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 blah. Until Jose got X, until Jose got cancer. So basically what I mean by that is that you want to start with that shared connection that invites the people into who you are as a person before you render yourself as this particular case, which is what's going to differentiate you from them. So that's one way to implement that idea. The next still applies to not use the passive voice when you name the villains, right? So instead of saying, I'm Laura, or in my invented example, I'm Jose, this is who I am, this is what I'm like, this is what I love, until this thing happened to me, which you're now invested in my story because you know me as a three-dimensional character, as opposed to knowing me first and foremost as a person who has this problem. Then instead of saying, and then my healthcare costs went through the roof, and then my bills skyrocketed, and then my claims were denied, all of which don't tell us where that came from. You then say, and then a handful of executives minting a fortune, you know, Bob Smith, whatever the person's name is, if you actually know, or Cigna or Blue Cross or whatever it is, Providence, chose to put my life and health up for sale, decided that their profits are worth more than our lives. So still want to use that active voice that applies when you're telling your own story. And then you also, and this is hard, if possible, want to talk about places where your advocacy, your singular storytelling has actually paid off, has actually resulted in some inadequate, insufficient American healthcare system still total crap, to use the technical terminology. But you want to give that sense that there's a payoff here. Like this could possibly work, as opposed to this is simply another form, and totally rightly so, of commiseration. This is actually storytelling toward a purpose, and here's some evidence that that purpose pays off.
Okay, thanks. So it's really important when we're telling our stories to give people the understanding that it's not just the sad thing that's happened or is happening, but there's something that we can do, and it's possible to do about it.
Yes. Yeah.
So many of us focus on healthcare in particular. And what can you say about messaging this topic, from high costs of healthcare to prescription drug costs, lack of insurance, and so on? Are there things to embrace or avoid on all these healthcare topics?
Yeah. So the first thing that I would say is that whenever we do the shared value at the opening of the message, we always want to do a values match. So if my message is going to be about the minimum wage, just to take a different example for a second, the opening value is going to be something like, whatever we look like, wherever we come from, most of us believe that people who work for a living ought to earn a living. That would be my opening value. If I'm going to do a message around prescription drug costs, or I'm going to do a message around healthcare or insurance, etc., my opening value is going to be about health. So it's going to be something like, no matter what we look like or where we come from, or whether we're white, black, or brown, Latino or Asian, Native or newcomer, we all want the very best care for our families. Or we all want to know that when we're ill or injured, we can get the care that we need. So you want to establish that feeling of like, oh, here's a thing that I understand. Here's a thing I relate to, because of course I feel that way. Like, you know, that opening value statement is the no duh. You're not alienating anyone. That's just like, humans feel things, and here are things that they feel, right? And then you want to go to that villain sentence, and you want to make it clear that, and this is a line that we often use in different issue areas, having Americans, having people struggle to get care is a choice we don't need to keep making. Is a choice we don't need to keep making. We want to make it clear that all of this is volitional. It's part of the reason why I don't, for example, recommend messaging that is about systemic inequities or systems of injustice. There's no such thing as systems. There are people in power, and those people have addresses. And unless we establish at the outset that a problem is person made, as I said before, it doesn't feel like it could be person fixed. Like, I'm supposed to go picket at systemic inequities house. I'm supposed to go, like, you know, tweet at, like, what is that, right? So you want to make clear who the villain is, and that villain may be a set of politicians, it may be a set of CEOs, it may be a set of corporations, it may be all of the above. And then you want to paint that beautiful tomorrow. I see a question in the chat, so I'm going to try to work it in. See if I can pull that off. Where we say, we can make this a place where your health and well-being is I don't want to say guaranteed, because nobody's health and well-being is guaranteed, right? Like, things happen, and, you know, there are things that money cannot buy, right? Not getting sick is not a thing. Getting care is a thing money can buy, but, you know, we can't guarantee that illness and injury won't happen. That's unfortunately part of the vagaries of life. So a beautiful tomorrow would be, we can make this a place where we all know that care is ours for the taking, or we can make this a place where whomever we love, wherever we live, we can access great care and never worry about the bill that comes later. It's that feeling of, in the healthcare space, of reassurance of like, we can make this a place where you see a doctor, you know, they deliver care that you trust, and you don't wonder about the bill that will come later. It's that kind of imageable sort of, I could draw a picture of that even if I'm a pretty bad drawer, as opposed to a more generic, and so we can deliver healthcare for all. That isn't so imageable. Like, what does that feel like to me when I go to the clinic?
Mm-hmm. It's back to talking about the brownie instead of the recipe.
Yes, yes. It's not the policy. It's the feeling of the policy's been enacted. And so, you know, it's basically, imagine going to a doctor you trust and having an appointment the length that you need to talk through what's going on, be heard, and get a diagnosis you can trust. Imagine driving home, scared, nervous about what the treatment will entail, but not thinking for a single moment about the bill that will come at the tail end of it. Imagine that the child you love is confronting an injury or an illness you never imagined, but every person who is providing their care is there to deliver the very best outcome without thinking for a single moment about profits. We can make this a country in which life and health is no longer for sale. Having too many Americans struggle is a choice we don't need to keep making. It's that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And how can people balance the personal storytelling with the overarching goal of why they're telling the story? So how much of your message is about you, this happened to you, you're living through this, versus what you want the audience to do? Is it 50-50? Do you start with the personal and then go to the action?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think that there is like a universal rule, and I don't think that there is easy math. I think that the most important thing to do is to recognize that there's lots of purposes to communication, but the purpose of strategic communications, of advocacy communications, which is different to journalism or different to being an academic or a historian or a researcher, all of which are valid reasons to communicate that I am not talking about right now. The purpose of strategic communications is really, there's only two. One is to make people feel the way you need them to feel, and to make them act, to behave, to engage in the behavior you need them to engage in. That's it. And so what you need to ask yourself is, what do I need people to feel when I'm done talking, and what do I need them to do? And so you need to structure back, you need to answer that question around the story and how much of the story to tell, and, you know, how many facts to provide or how much context or whatever, on the basis of, is it going to make people do the thing I need them to do, and first feel the thing I need them to feel and do the thing I need them to do. And so if the thing that you need them to do is inventing, to contact, you know, a certain set of lawmakers about a healthcare provision or a bill that is actually out on the table, then you're going to need to, in that discourse, make them feel like that action is worthwhile. Like, it's not just going to be an exercise or a tweet or a text or a phone call in futility. And that means that maybe in that particular piece of communication, you tell less of your story and you tell more of how your story actually got 10,000 people to tell their story, or 10,000 people to text, or 10,000 people to whatever the action is. And you focus more on that because you're trying to create that behavior.
Great. Thanks. So thank you so much for your time tonight. Is there anything else you would like to share with our storytelling audience? Anything specific to the infrastructure bills that are being talked about right now, or anything else you'd like to leave them with?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. It's that cynicism I was talking about. That's very understandable. Well, there we are, very much understanding it. So I get that it's hard. I feel the struggle myself. I will be completely honest with your audience. I guess what I would say about that is that it's absolutely important that we continue to frame all of this, like I said, as, oh, here's my real life intruding into Estoy haciendo una presentación.
Okay. So quería preguntar algo?
No ahorita. Sorry, Laura. That's my real life. So what I would say is that we really, really want to emphasize that all of this is volitional. I'm not a huge fan of the word infrastructure. I don't think that infrastructure is a particularly like cuddly thing. It's also a very, what we call a high register word. It's not sort of like among the first 200 words that a person generally says unless they work in the White House, right? It's not like tripping off the tongue. So instead of talking about that, we want to talk about delivering the care that our families need, delivering the future that we want, making sure that we can get and stay well. We want to keep it always in that realm of ways that normal people talk on a day-to-day basis and feelings that they have, as opposed to kind of impersonal things like infrastructure.
Okay, and if we need to talk about a real thing, then people should be saying the American Jobs and Family Plan or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you, Anat. Thank you, audience. Be sure to watch some of our old videos on messaging and writing op-eds, and we'll hopefully have new trainings in the future. Thank you again for your time and your expertise.
Thanks for letting Diego make a cameo.
Good night, all.